Hi, my name is Alex Gouch. I'm a fish biologist on Lake Ontario. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and today I'm going to be talking to you about some seasonal movements of Cisco in the eastern basin of Lake Ontario. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors, Dimitri Gorski, Brian Weidel, Zai Biesinger, Michael Connerton, and Brian O'Malley. And before I start, I'd really like to thank some of our collaborating partners on this project, which included the USGS Lake Ontario Biological Station and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation Lake Ontario unit. Okay, to give you a background of the importance of our project, really the interests have been in restoration efforts for native forage basin in the Great Lakes for the last few years, and particularly in the Coregonus species. So those including lake whitefish and the different Cisco species. Today we're going to be just focusing on lake herring or Cisco Coregonus artedi. This is one of the native forage species in Lake Ontario. So throughout the Great Lakes, there's been a reduction in Cisco populations, but particularly in Lake Ontario, there really is only a couple remnant populations left in the eastern basin of Lake Ontario. And if we look at the USGS trawl surveys and some of their data, we can see that recruitment is it's sporadic, and it's really only driven by a few year classes. So this figure in the bottom right corner shows you the different basins of Lake Ontario, and what we see is that the eastern basin has the highest relative abundance of Cisco, but really, again, they are sporadic. And so the Cisco that we do have currently in Lake Ontario are really being sourced from two spawning populations, one in Chameau Bay on the U.S. waters of Lake Ontario, and the other being Bay of Quinte in the Canadian waters of Lake Ontario. And this Chameau Bay population is an important population for our research because it's been used in our hatchery system as a brood stock. So it briefly was used to stock Lake Ontario, but it's currently being used to stock some of the inland lakes in New York. And while we know a bit about this population, there are still some questions that remain that some of our research can help to inform. Some of those being the mixing of populations. So we have a poor understanding of how much these populations between Chameau Bay and the Bay of Quinte are mixing, and similarly, how much site fidelity is there. So these are a Salmonidae. They likely are expressing some sorts of site fidelity, but we don't really know the extent. We also have an understanding of spawn timing and location within Chameau Bay of where they're spawning, but we don't know the full extent of the entire spawning period or the extent of the areas within Chameau Bay that these fish are using to spawn. And these ultimately are leading up to the largest question, which is what are some of these local factors that are affecting early life survival? So why are we seeing sporadic year classes throughout Lake Ontario? And so the project that we're going to be talking about today is really the first steps in trying to identify some of these spawning areas, spawning times in Chameau Bay, which are then going to be used to inform our future research on variables affecting spawning success. So to fill some of the knowledge gaps about the Chameau Bay spawning stock, we have a few study objectives for our specific project. The first being to describe seasonal patterns in the Cisco's movement. So at different times of the year, where are they in the lake? Are they returning to Chameau Bay for spawning seasons? The second would be to determine if Cisco's demonstrate any site fidelity to spawning locations. So is there a mixed stock between Chameau Bay and Bay of Quinte, or do these fish return to Chameau Bay each year? And finally, we're looking to identify some spawning locations in Chameau Bay and look at the spatial temporal trends associated with the staging time period and also the spawning behavior as well. To tackle some of these research objectives, we use two different methods. We use both acoustic telemetry, and we ground truth that telemetry with egg collections. So from 2016 to 2021, we had tracked 76 reproductively mature Cisco around Chameau Bay and outside of Chameau Bay in the main lake as well. The fish that we had tagged came from the Bay population, and they were tagged from 2016 to 2018 in November and December in each one of those years. Our acoustic array within Chameau Bay was 26 receivers wide, and then when fish left the bay, we used the collaborating GLaDOS network as well to track fish within the Bay of Quinte and outside of the bays as well. And then to process this data, we use a more fine-scale method of centers of activity, which basically just means if a fish was detected on more than one receiver, we're able to use trilateration to more accurately pinpoint where that fish actually was detected at. And we were very lucky that in 2019, the USGS was also doing a Cisco egg collection in Shimo Bay, so we were able to ground truth our telemetry detections. We used egg traps that were developed by Brian Waddell at USGS, and we had set 105 traps from November 17th to December 9th in Shimo Bay on shoals and suspected spawning areas that had previously been identified by Matt Brevet. And this figure here gives you an idea of what our array looked like. The black points are those receivers that are maintained by our GLaDOS collaborative network, where the blue points are our Shimo Bay receiver locations. And when we take a closer look at the Shimo Bay site, we can see that in 2017 and 18, our array really focused on one of the main spawning shoals, which is Johnson Shoal, outlined by the red marks there. And in 2019, 2021, our array really expanded to kind of give us a bay-wide approach at looking at movement within the bay. All right, let's jump right into the results and show you what we found. So this is going to be a figure of 2020, and we'll be looking at the movements of some of these Cisco. I'll just remind you that the black dots here are individual receivers, and the colored dots are individual fish. And so this video is going to run from 2020 on January 1st throughout the year until December 31st. What we're really going to see is by about April, May, Cisco are going to move out of Shimo Bay, where they've spawned throughout the winter, and are going to start dispersing throughout the lake. And I want to point out some of these interesting detections, like in Rochester, which is the southwest corner of this map, and the Bay of Quinte, which is the northernmost bay in this map. And that we have some of these fish that hang out in these areas throughout the year, but as soon as the spawning season starts, they move directly back to Shimo Bay. We'll start to see all the fish come back to Shimo Bay. This is during the spawning season. It lasts about a month from November 1st to December 1st. And then these fish that are either in Rochester or in the Bay of Quinte move directly back to those areas. And so we kind of have variance in what fish do after the spawning season as well as before the spawning season. We can also look at this data in a bit of a different way, looking at seasonal time budgets. So this figure here shows you daily zone assignments. On the x-axis, you have the date. On the y, it's a percent of tag Cisco. So each one of these lines is a single day within that time period, and it assigns a zone to each one of our Cisco, and then looks at the percentage of each of those, of that full sample size, to give you zone assignments. And what we see is annually there are these patterns within movements into and out of Shimo Bay. And what I really want to focus on here is this period of November 1st to December 1st, and that's what these black lines represent. And during this time period is the typical spawning period for Cisco in Lake Ontario. And we see that we get 100% of our tag Cisco returning to Shimo Bay. So we're seeing 100% spawning site fidelity here with this population. And after that December 1st period, we start to see a bit of variation. Some fish return directly to the lake, some to this Black River Channel, which is kind of the staging area outside of Shimo Bay. And then some fish return to the Bay of Quinte as well, and they kind of hang out there throughout the year. We can also look at some more of our fine scale results from within Shimo Bay itself. And what we see is that there's a wide range of the amount of time that's spent within the bay during the spawning season. So if you remember our time budget plot, it looked like about half of the fish left the bay directly after spawning, while half of the fish stayed in the bay until April. So we see a very wide range in our average time spent there. When we look across years, we also see an average peak spawn. So this is when 100% of our tagged fish are within the bay itself. And that starts about November 2nd and runs until about December 10th. Which corresponds with some of these average water temperatures around 8.4 degrees at the start of the spawning period and about 3.8 degrees at the end of the spawning period. And so this figure on the right kind of shows you a heat map, if you will, of our centers of activities throughout this grid. So each one of those little grid marks are about 200 meters by 200 meters. And then we take the total number of COAs within each one of those grids. And what we see is that the highest concentration of our COAs are on major spawning shoals, including Johnson Shoal. So this figure here specifically shows you in orange where the outline of Johnson Shoal where these fish are congregating from November 16th to about the 20th. And we can also look across years. So this figure shows you 1 week bins starting at the top, working your way down until December 13th across years. And you can see when the fish really start to concentrate on some of these major spawning shoals and then start to leave the bay as well. While our detection data from our acoustic telemetry is great, we really want to look at our ground truthing data to see if fish are spawning in those areas that are identified as hot zones or areas where there are high concentrations during the spawning time. And what we see from our egg collection data is that, yes, they match. We are seeing high egg depositions in those areas that we see high concentrations of fish during the spawning period. And that was a lot of results sections very quickly, so feel free to go back through and check those out. But now I'm going to give you some quick discussion points, starting with our objectives. So our first objective is kind of to describe some of these seasonal patterns and movements. And what we saw is that they were really driven by spawning site fidelity. So no matter where the fish were during the spring, the summer, or the fall, they consistently returned to Shimo Bay. And some of the interesting examples are the fish that came from the Rochester area or the Bay of Quinte area, which are quite a distance from Shimo Bay. They moved to the bay to spawn and then quickly went back to those areas in Rochester and the Bay of Quinte. What we're hypothesizing is that seasonal patterns are also driven by food sources. So we know that in the wintertime, Cisco are feeding heavily on their own eggs and like whitefish eggs in Shimo Bay. So this might explain why half the population is kind of hanging out in the bay until spring when water temperatures rise. Well, some of the other fish may be feeding on ichthyoplankton and zooplankton in the main lake. And finally, with some of our seasonal patterns, we saw that there were a small proportion of the Shimo stock that's entering the Bay of Quinte. However, this was outside of the spawning period, so it's unlikely that those two populations are mixing, or at least we can say, given our data, it's unlikely that the Shimo Bay population is mixing during spawning seasons with the Bay of Quinte population. Our second objective was to determine if Cisco were demonstrating any type of site fidelity, and as we've seen, there was 100% spawning site fidelity with our tagged fish in Shimo Bay, and this is really a common salmonid trait, so it's kind of to be expected. But some of the questions were remaining is spawning site fidelity site specific within Shimo Bay? So if a fish was hatched over a specific shoal within the bay, are those fish returning to that shoal, or do they use the entire bay itself? And are there habitat specific traits that are drawing Cisco to spawning? So we have a current project right now looking at habitat characteristics and spawning, as well as hatching success. And so we're going to be using some of our telemetry data to help aid that project as well. And our third objective is to identify some of the specific spawning locations within Shimo Bay and to look at some of the spatial temporal trends associated with spawning. And what we saw was that Cisco concentrated on really one spawning shoal, or they had the highest concentrations on this one shoal called Johnson Shoal. And what we think might be happening is a tagging bias here. So if Cisco are, in fact, site-specific, showing site-specific spawning fidelity, that meaning if you were hatched in a certain shoal, then you may return to that certain shoal to spawn, that we may have tagged fish all from one area. So the majority of our fish were tagged on or near Johnson Shoal, and so we might be really selecting for that behavior, to see that behavior with our telemetry, just because we didn't expand the number of areas that we collected fish from within the bay. What we also saw was that there were very high concentrations of COAs on shallow rocky shoals, even outside of Johnson Shoal. And so what we're thinking about now is, are there habitat characteristics that Cisco are selecting for? So there's a bit of dispute whether Cisco are really a true pelagic broadcast spawner or if they are a habitat-specific spawner. And so our future research is really looking at what type of habitat characteristics these Cisco are spawning over, and the survival of those eggs in certain substrates and habitat types as well. And this really leads us into our final management implications here. So the sites that were identified in Shimo Bay are going to help us inform some future research on early life survival. So we do have a bit of sporadic year classes and variation in recruitment from year to year. And so to tackle some of the questions associated with that sporadic nature of this population, we're going to start looking at early life survival. And we now have some great sample sites that have been identified by telemetry. We're also able to identify the extent of the peak spawn, or the time that the most Cisco are within the bay. And this can help us kind of collect an even distribution for our brood stock program. So we want to collect fish that spawn early, that spawn in the middle of the spawning period, and at the end as well. And by knowing the full extent of the spawning period, we can start to collect fish to really get a great hatchery product. And finally, it looks like from our data that the Chameau Bay stock really isn't mixing with the Bay of Quinte stock during spawning season. So these are two separate, potentially separate stocks, which could be managed in different ways. So one stock is in Canada, one is in the United States. And when we think about things like commercial fishing, recreational fishing, and different types of restoration programs, we may be able to manage these populations in different ways if they're not mixing with each other. And thank you very much for taking the time to listen to my presentation today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I mean, you can also follow this project or others on my ResearchGate as well.